Alan, would you like to comment on Susan's remarks, but also in the view you described yourself as conveying the conflict through families and their histories and the importance of history in conflict? You sounded like an educator, as you are at Harvard Law School. You're also an advocate, and even to the point where Benjamin Netanyahu asked you to be Israel's ambassador to the UN, which you chose not to do. Educator, advocate, how do we think about this in a literary context?
Well, the first half of Susan's presentation, I would have been happy to comment about as an educator. We were both talking about peace and narrative, but then the last half of our conversation moved to an absolute screed based on total falsehoods. And I have no choice but to respond to the list of falsehoods and defamations, culminating in the call for unilateral boycotts and divestment from the Jewish nation. Let's start with 1948, where she begins. In 1948, the UN, after years and years of conflict, and after the Peel Commission report, decided to allocate 55% of the arable land in what was the disputed area, having, by the way, allocated 80% of what was traditional Palestine, as it was defined, to Transjordan, which has 60% Palestinian population, allocated the remaining 55% of the arable land to a Palestinian state, and 45% of it to a Jewish state. The Jewish state would have a Jewish majority. The Palestinian state would have a Palestinian majority. The Jews, at the request of David Ben-Gurion, were given the Negev, which constituted a large area of non-arable land that neither side really was pushing for. The Israelis reluctantly accepted the division, and had the Palestinians accepted the division, there would have been no expulsions. There would be no refugees, but instead the Palestinians and all the Arab countries started what they called the genocidal war to try to finish Hitler's work. Remember who the leader of the Palestinians was at the time. It was a man named Hussein, who had spent the war years in Nazi Germany with Adolf Hitler. And remember that many Palestinians, some think most, Sayyad, in his writings, has said that the hero of the Palestinian people during this period of time was this Nazi named Husseini. And Husseini was directing the efforts from Egypt, where he was an escaped war criminal, having been indicted at Nuremberg. He was the most popular Palestinian leader at the time. He called for the genocidal attack on the Jewish state. That genocidal attack on the Jewish state, which came very close to succeeding, it caused 1% of Israelis, many of whom were Holocaust survivors, to be killed, most of whom were civilians, and that resulted in two refugee problems. About 700,000 Palestinians left, many of them at the request of their own leaders, who said, leave now and come back as heroes. It also resulted in 770,000 Jews who had lived for thousands of years in places like Yemen and Iraq and other Arab countries, being expelled from their countries. There was an exchange of population, and that exchange of population led to the situation where in 1967, the West Bank was not occupied by Israel. The West Bank was occupied by Jordan. Gaza was occupied by Egypt. When Egypt and Syria planned another genocidal war in 1967, to destroy the Jewish state of Israel, Israel did everything in its power to try to persuade Jordan not to enter the war. It sent Golda Meir and others to the Jordanians, saying, we won't even try to capture, the Israelis said, Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, which had been unlawfully captured during the 48 war, if you don't attack us. And of course, Jordan then commenced an attack, lobbed 1,600 shells into downtown West Jerusalem, and Israel had no choice but to respond. In 1967, the narrative, because I think she had...
But we're up to 1967.
Yeah, it'll take me 2 more minutes. It'll take me 2 more minutes.
2 minutes, but as you go forward, your book purports to be educational.
Yes, but I must respond. Look, we have an audience here today that We have an audience here today that when I finished my talk did not give any applause, even though I said nothing political, and an audience when my, I thought, friend and opponent gave her screed, gave a long applause. I will insist on presenting the counter-narrative. In 1967, it'll take me 2 minutes, in 1967, the Israelis sat from waiting for a call for peace based on return of all of the captured lands. Instead, all the Arab countries led by the Palestinian leadership went to Khartoum and issued their three famous no's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiation. Everything flows from that narrative. 30 seconds on Jenin. No mention that there was a massacre that led to Jenin. The massacre was the massacre of 55 Jewish people sitting at a Seder in the Park Hotel just before Jenin, and Palestinian terrorists from Jenin went in and murdered 55 Israeli family members having a Seder. Israel responded not from the air, which they had the right to do, but on the ground, losing 23 Israeli soldiers, which resulted in a lawsuit by the family members saying, why didn't you drop bombs? Why did you send their soldiers in? There was no massacre at Jenin. That results in, that's why she had to write fiction about it. It didn't happen. There was a battle in Jenin in which fewer people died than were killed at the Park Hotel, most of whom were terrorists. This is total fiction. Total false fiction. You must learn the facts. The facts are different, and the facts are on both sides.
And there's a lot of, but I'd like to frame this and give you a few moments. Because this conversation and versions of this conversation happen in so many places, and they're important. But what makes our time here distinctive and special is how your fictional works relate to these really painful elements. Now, I'm actually saying this to both, but I'd love, as you, in a sense, respond, how does your novel respond to this?
Well, it is a historic fiction, and by historic, it means that the historic aspects of the book are absolutely accurate. I was in Jenin during that massacre, and I was one of the first eyewitnesses to the aftermath of that massacre, and there were bombs in fact dropped, and I saw the remnants of them. And I read the reports from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and they absolutely corroborate what I said. I would encourage anyone to just go and look at those for yourselves. You don't even have to take my word for it. You know, all this smoke and stuff about 48 and going through. So let me just, luckily Israeli leaders have been more honest and forthright than Mr. Dershowitz. So I'm just going to read you a few quotes. David Ben-Gurion: if I were an Arab leader, I would never sign an agreement with Israel. It is normal. We have taken their country.
That's a famous false quote that has been totally discredited. It never happened. It is a false quote. It appears in every Palestinian propaganda piece.
Let her speak.
Second quote, also by David Ben-Gurion:
Never happened.
we must expel the Arabs
Didn't
and
even
take
listen.
their places. Quoted in Ben-Gurion and the Palestine Arabs, Oxford Press, 1985.
Tell you what, I'll bet you $1,000 right now that quote.
Let her complete what she's saying.
$1,000 to Hamas.
She didn't interrupt you.
That quote occurred.
I
It's a
find
false
that-
quote.
I find that when people perpetually interrupt others, that either they're afraid of what their opponent is going to say,
Lies need to be interrupted.
or they just like to hear themselves speak. In either case,
They're justifiers of the
warranted and infantile. The other quote, this one by Raphael Eitan, Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, quoted in the New York Times in 1983. When we have settled the land, all the Arabs will be able to do about it will be to scurry around like drugged cockroaches in a bottle.
Would you like to
Vladimir
quote some
Jabotinsky.
Palestinian leaders? Would you like to quote
Has any
Hussein?
people ever been seen to give up their territory of their own free will? In the same way, the Arabs of Palestine will not renounce their sovereignty without violence. I also, in response to this claim of an existential threat against Israel in 1967, this quote is by Israeli General Matzyahu Peled. It's quoted in the Haaretz, March 19, 1972. He says, and I quote, "The thesis that the danger of genocide was hanging over us in June of 1967, and that Israel was fighting for its physical existence, is only bluff, which was born and developed after the war." These are not falsities. These are realities that have been written about. They have been verified by Israel's own historians. The ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is not a myth. It's not falsities, as Mr. Dershowitz would have you believe. It's a reality. 3 million Palestinians live in refugee camps that are not fit for human beings. The rest of us live in a diaspora or live under an unbelievably cruel military occupation that has been condemned by every human rights organization that has ever observed the situation there. Most recently, Richard Goldstone, which again Mr. Dershowitz called a liar and despicable and a Moser of all things, accused Israel of war crimes and the more serious crime of crimes against humanity. These are not falsities, these are realities. Israel has imprisoned an entire people, denied them food, denied them access to clean water, has bombed their schools, has turned 80% of Gaza's children suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Fishermen are not allowed to go and catch fish. People cannot go about their lives. And this has been called by another scholar, which Mr. Dershowitz has also called a liar.
Susan, I'm actually giving you more time than I
Okay,
gave
that's
out.
fine, yeah.
And I think there are so many places in which these, I don't want to call them narratives, I would call them debates, happen. And they're important debates.
Well, let's talk about the future. Let's talk about the future. Susan suggested in her remarks that she does not favor the two-state solution. Can we ask her directly? She talked about Palestine being a multicultural. That sounded to me like the one-state solution. Do you favor the two-state solution?
So I'm gonna pause here.
You don't. Okay, that's clear. She does not favor the two-state
I'll tell
solution.
you, I need to respond to that, Jim, please.
I will absolutely let you
It's a very important concession.
And I respond to that.
And
but I-
just you, and just procedure point. Procedure point. Absolutely, I'd love you to respond. So we'll come to this question of the two-state solution and the role.
It's not a two-state solution.
But procedural point. We've advertised that audiences will be able to ask some questions. So I'm going to ask you to respond briefly, and those of you who would like to ask questions, there are microphones here. I'll ask you to ask questions after stating your name. Keep the questions to less than a minute, and they must end with a question mark. Okay? Now, so as we line up, Susan, may I ask you very briefly, not so much to justify the issue that Alan asked, and perhaps what your book implies about a two-state solution or not?
Well, I don't believe in any nation that measures the worth of a human being by their religion any more than I do in states that measure the worth of a human being by the color of their skin.
Like the
etc.
Palestinian Authority, which is a Muslim
In fact,
authority.
Israel is a state that is founded on the principle of Jewish entitlement and exclusivity, and that's a fact. I don't support that. I don't support that anywhere. I don't support it in Muslim countries. I don't support any kind of basically measuring the worth of a human being, like I said, by such arbitrary measures. And
So
I
religious-based
do
states
believe, yeah.
are not consistent with the message of Imam.
I beg your pardon?
Religion-based
I don't believe in theocracies, period. I don't believe anywhere.
Let me respond to that.
So-
Israel is the most secular country in the Middle
Absolutely,
East.
it's not.
85% of Israelis is secular. Nobody has ever said Israel is a Jewish nation. It is the nation of the Jewish people in the same way that France is the nation of the French people. The Palestinian Constitution sets out that Palestine will be a Muslim state.
No,
Every single
no, it doesn't.
Arab
No, it
state
doesn't.
is a
That's an outright lie.
Muslim state. Every single Muslim state denies rights to its citizens. Jews can't even be citizens of Jordan. Jews can't live freely in Egypt. I've been in those places. Let's talk about reality. You don't accept the right of the Jewish people to have a state, but you insist on the right of the Palestinian people to have a state. You reject the two-state solution. You reject the ongoing peace process. You reject efforts to try to resolve this thing in a peaceful way with two states. You are an extremist. You are a zealot. And your views are to be rejected by history.
Excuse me, whose question is this, his or
I
hers?
think that, I've just been called today, and I think this is Mr. Dershowitz's MO. He has called anyone who disagrees with him this infantile name-calling from moral authorities, Desmond Tutu, whom he called the most evil man in the world, Jimmy Carter, another moral authority, who he likewise called despicable, bigot, liar, impeccable scholars like Walt and Mearsheimer and Chomsky and
Really
Dickinson. Richard Goldstone, like I said, whom he called a Moser, Richard Goldstone was a professed Zionist and a man of unimpeachable professionalism and integrity. And, the list goes on and on of
So we get the
everyone who
disagreement.
disagrees with
We
him gets
get-
called these names. So
Okay.
now I'm an extremist, and quite
Well,
frankly,
but you
I'm
reject
tempted
the
and
two-state
honored to
solution.
be
That
called
is
to be
extremism.
put in the category that all people
You out there reject the two-state solution as well. Fine. If you reject the two-state solution, fine, because that's what you're going to get, a rejection of the two-state solution. The only way the occupation is going to end, the way the occupation of Germany ended, the way the occupation of Japan ended, is with peace. The only way you're going to get peace is the two-state solution. If you think that Israel is going to commit politicide, is going to give up its right to be a Jewish nation, you're living in an unreal world. Yes, that's extremism. Yes, that's zealotism. What we're hearing here is a supporter of Hamas and Hezbollah, not a
Nothing is
supporter of
left
the
to us.
two-state
We're
solution.
states.
She can speak in a calm voice and write nice novels, but she is an extremist, and she is a barrier to peace. You have to understand.
I would love to hear from the first question. Because this is an opportunity for us to really hear from and understand radically different points of view, expressed literarily and otherwise. Now I'm interested in what you'd like to ask. The only thing is I'm going to be a lot stricter about this being a question.
My question has two parts, and I'll be very brief. The first part is you're too young to remember the previously mentioned Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini. He was the major political and religious leader of Arabs. There was one person who was willing to talk to... I'm coming to the question. Stop interrupting me. Stop interrupting me. That's a sabotage. The question is that, are you aware that the one person who was willing to talk to a group of Jews who wanted your solution, Martin Buber, Yehuda Leib Magnus, head of Hebrew University, and others, was murdered. He was from the tribe of Husseini, you mentioned. He was murdered for talking to Jews. And then same Husseini, while he was in the environment of...
What is your question?
I'm coming to it. When he was in the environment of Hitler, got his promise that when Palestine would be conquered, Jews will be murdered. That attitude never changed. And The second part of the question is that here, the right
I'm sorry, I'm missing the first part of your question.
The question is, are you aware of the intention to destroy the Jews, which never stopped, and Hamas has it in its covenant?
Okay,
Would you
so
respond?
a question, and I...
Am I aware of someone's intention? But you did mention Martin Buber, so I actually have a quote by him. Martin Buber said, "We will have to face the reality that Israel is neither innocent nor redemptive, and in its creation, the expansion, we as Jews have caused what we historically have suffered, a refugee population in diaspora." I don't know what your point is to talk about Hashemi and Husseini, whether, it's to say that you deserve to be expelled or what the purpose of that is. I think that is, in various forms and throughout history, I think this is a very imperialist argument and colonial argument has been to point to what are misdeeds or to point to the natives as savages or violent or uncivilized and so unlike us in order to justify their mass murder and expulsion and so forth. This is not an old. It's not an old argument. It's recycled material from centuries of conquerors and imperialists, not just in Palestine, but throughout the world. And it is designed so that when people hear that, and when you can convince people of how awful and how evil the natives are, then they don't ask the questions. They don't ask questions. Why are they living in this open-air prison? Why are they surrounded by walls and checkpoints?
And the answer is because they're leaders who are not uncivilized, but are
There is no answer to that. You don't have the right to do that to the native people.
You're making such a phony argument.
And Mr. Dershowitz's insistence on the two-state solution is frankly, this is such propaganda because
Two-state solution is propaganda.
Israel has rejected that from the beginning, and what they have done on the ground is absolute proof of that. No one even needs to say anything because thus far, Israel has swallowed up effectively 50% of the West Bank, which was supposed to be the Palestinian state.
So listen
and
to
like
that.
I said,
Just listen to that nonsense. Israel has rejected the two-state solution. It accepted it in 48. It accepted it in 67. It offered it in 2000, 2001. It's offering it today. There's only one person on this stage who rejects the two-state solution, and that is this woman who supports Hamas, who supports Hezbollah, who supports Husseini, and who rejects the Israel, and Israel is not going to accept that, and I'm not going to accept that. And I will not sit silently in the face of this kind of Israeli characters who are all anti-Israel butchers who acknowledge what they've done is horrible, 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 but because she's written a screed. My Palestinian characters are supporters of the two-state solution. My Palestinian characters are ones who want to bring about peace. Even the terrorists, in whose mouth I put the case against Israel's right to exist, makes that case articulately. Two cases, actually. I have two characters. One, a Marxist from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who makes the kind of anti-colonial claims against Israel, and the other, an Islamic extremist who believes that perspective. I try very hard to present characters. What she presents and what she's presenting here today are stick figure, totally fake presentations of Israelis. For her, it's a one-sided conflict. For her, there is no truth on the side of Israel. For her, there was no Holocaust. For her, there was no Hajj al-Husseini. For her, there was no Yasser Arafat. For her, oh, shut up. For her, there were no rockets from Gaza. To her, there were no Park Hotel. For her, there were no terrorist attacks. For her, this is all.
Why don't you tell us what you feel? Forget about what her.
You don't want to listen. My suggestion to Susan is what my son's suggestion was. Buy a billboard, write a screed.
We have the chance here.
I told you, you don't, hey buddy, you don't like my answer, but I gave you an answer. I gave it.
Answer the question.
All right. I told you I
We have time for one more question. And whether or not people think that the answers are right, wrong, germane, or not, we learned something about the people who are giving them.
Look, there was
Okay,
real hope
one
that
more
we might
question.
have been able to come together here today, but that hope was dashed by the call for boycotts and divestment, by turning a literary event into a crass political event, and the fault for that lies 100% on her side. 100%. I presented a balanced literary presentation, and she responded with a call for boycotts and divestment. Shame on you.
Good for you.
You know, when in my opening statements, in fact, I was not calling. I was telling you of all the people in the world, the churches and the organizations who have heeded that call to boycott Israel. And the moral authority that is behind that, and the people. These are not bigots. These are not.
Yes,
these
they
are not
are.
crazy people. No, these in fact
Anybody
are
who calls
people
for
of
a
conscience.
boycott or divestment against Israel and doesn't say a word about Darfur
this is
or
where
Rwanda is a
nobody can
bigot.
speak, and when you say something he disagrees with, he calls you a name. And this is, I find that unseemly and really unbecoming of a Harvard professor, frankly.
Live their lives, how Harvard professors should conduct their lives. Okay.
I'm allowed to have an opinion.
So, and I've told her her novelist should write novels. If we
I
thought,
actually have read your novel. I don't think you've read mine. And in fact, I think that your depiction of Arabs is quite cartoonish. And I was really quite shocked by how little understanding you have of not just Palestinian society, but of the situation on the ground and the realities on the ground. The fact that, for example, a van cannot drive from Jerusalem to Jericho unimpeded. It's, you know, I mean, there are so many holes and that really betray your lack of knowledge of what's happening on the ground.
of course a van can drive, of course a van can
I
drive
found it
from
very
Jerusalem to
cynical.
Jericho.
And I found it
I've
very
done it.
cynical.
We've done it.
All right, so this is
I
a
find it very
topic.
cynical. I just want to say, I find it very cynical that he used, that he named his main terrorist in this novel by the name of Faisal Husseini, which is
Yeah,
one
so
of
is the type.
Palestine's most beloved sons. And, you know, that in itself I find to be extremely...
Okay, we
purposely
understand.
named my terrorist Husseini to remind everybody that the leader of the Palestinian people during the Second World War was a Nazi. Yes, I purposely made that point. And that his picture with Hitler adorned the homes of many Palestinian families.
we are out of time.
I got that from Edward Said.
So, my friends, we are out of time. And the idea of confining a discussion to a novel and a novelistic and literary context, for sure, is at least as hard as a cheating piece.
Well, I did it.
And so those of you,
My conversation was completely about the novel.
we've learned what the authors wanted to say about their novels, about the others,
Give another
to
topic.
some extent about each other.
About the novel.
And I want to thank people for coming. There will be a book signing for 15 minutes on each side. Is this correct? And Susan, your books will be signed over here. Is this correct? Alan, yours over here. Thank you much. Thank you for the audience. And see you later.
That was